Award-winning writer, journalist, and author Ta-Nehisi Coates is best known for his work fighting systemic racism and inequality inside of the United States. But now, he's entered the conversation on Israel and Palestine. In his new book, The Message, Coates reflects on questions of race, identity, colonialism, and the politics of writing in separate trips to Senegal, South Carolina, and Israel and occupied Palestine. So what insight can one of America's most prominent writers offer on this conflict? And why has he entered this conversation now? Earlier, I went to New York to speak to Ta-Nehisi Coates in an UpFront special. Ta-Nehisi Coates, welcome to UpFront.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, man, so good to meet you, brother. This is your first nonfiction book in 7 years. Mm-hmm. You talk about a sense of duty too, particularly in the opening chapter around journalism and of telling truths, that you can't just be abstract. You can't just revel in the artistry of it all.
Yeah.
Was there something about this moment that made you feel more compelled to do this?
No. It's I it just so happens that it's the moment. You know what I mean? It just, honestly, in fact, I got through, I was about halfway through writing the last chapter of the book. And there was so much reporting and things that I saw that didn't make it in. And I was like, you know what? This whole book should actually be about Palestine. We should take another year. I should somehow try to find a way to pull everything in there. And my editor was probably freaking out. And he asked me to send him what I had written, and I sent them. He said, just keep going. Just keep going. He said, it's time. And he was right. It is time. I would hate to have waited another year. I really would have. I'm glad it's out now.
There's a way that it's the perfect moment, but there's also a way that it's an incredibly inopportune moment in the sense that we're in the middle of a genocide in Gaza.
Yeah.
And you're writing a really intense and I would say smart critique of the Israeli occupation. Mm-hmm. When you started writing that essay, did you anticipate that kind of response?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I knew it was going to be a lot of blowback.
Okay.
I knew that there was just no way. The thing is, when I was over there, it wasn't just the occupation. And this is, I think, where it gets really hard for people. I think this is the hard part for people. I think there are people who can understand that this occupation, apartheid on the West Bank, Gaza, they can understand that as unjust. But when you get to the roots of the state, and you start saying, I don't know if there should be ethno-states, period. I don't know that I believe that a state should set itself up in such a way that one ethnic group will have rights that others will not. I think if I said that in the abstract, people would say, yeah, that's probably right.
Of course.
But I think because of the weight, the real weight, and the lethal weight of anti-Semitism in the history of the West, culminating obviously in the Holocaust, the fact that the Holocaust is within the living memory of human history, I think we have a lot, around that, as we should. Probably the problem comes in when how we decide that, that debt should be paid. But, once I saw that, Mark, to get back to your question, I was like, my life will never be the same. On seeing it, I was like, this is over.
Wow.
Some aspect of my life is over. I'm talking about before I had written anything.
That's not just an intellectual or political issue for you. That was at the emotional, psychological level as well.
Man, there's a point in the book where I talk about how I had gone to this retreat. And, we had hiked up the hill, and this was at the end of the midpoint of my trip. So the first half was with the Palestinian Literary Festival, second half mostly with this group Breaking the Silence, a group of IDF veterans that I know you're familiar with. And I got to the top of this hike we took, and I sat in this room, and I was I just had this feeling I've just walked through a door, and you can't get back to the other side. And I think so I knew after that, you know what I mean? I knew I was going to write about it. I knew, and I knew, what the reaction was going to be. The only question was, could I do the job that I needed to do,
What's key to you for doing that job, for executing that job properly?
That's a great question. So I knew what I had seen, but, I'm a historical thinker. And so it's and I mean that literally. I don't mean that as a humble brag or something. Literally, I think in terms of story. So why is it that way? Why has this happened? You know what I mean? What has come to that? So I needed to read a lot of the historical documents. I needed to put in context what I was saying. There were people who had said things to me about, basic unfairnesses and I needed to see them in a more systemized form. I need to read reports. There was a lot of terminology, as you know. So people say area A, area B, area C over and over again. And I really needed to know like what that meant. Yeah. You know what I mean? I didn't get to Gaza. So I didn't really understand, you know, much about Gaza, which is, you know, very different from the West Bank. And even like it's harder to get to. Like it's a whole different process. And so like having all of that, you know, like to me, as I've said, like the morality of it is not complex, but obviously the system of it is. And so coming to try to understand it on enough of a systemic level that I felt like I could write and make the basic point, you know, which is to me, we are supporting a system of apartheid. And I don't think most Americans understand that. And why don't they understand it? You know, like that was the essence of what I was trying to do.
Wow. It's interesting because while your essay is largely focused on Palestinian suffering, you actually start with your visit to Yad Vashem, which is Israel's memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. As a writer, why did you start there? It felt like a very intentional choice.
It was, man. I mean, first of all, two things happened. The experience I had there was very real. So all of that emotional, and that was probably day 9, I think. So I had seen, it wasn't like that was the first thing I saw. That was like the last thing I saw, you know? And the emotional experience that I had as I write about was very, very real. And there was something about the fact that I was at that point very clear about what the state was doing. But that, I guess, that didn't make me feel like I needed to reject the experience which the state calls upon, the heritage that the state calls upon to even, you know, do what it does.
Yeah.
That I was still moved by both. And I was wondering, like, how do you write about that?
Yeah.
And how do you reconcile it? And how do you write about it in not such a way that says, on the one hand this, on the other hand that?
Right.
Like, how do you forge it into a singular narrative, right? And as I thought about it, I thought about some of our more nascent dreams as African Americans, some of the things that we've, you know, wanted. And this came from other chapters in the book, obviously, you know,
right.
our own dreams of nationalism and how you can have a very, very real history. Not even just a victimization, but enslavement, genocide, pogroms, ethnic cleansing, etc. And how we have this belief that that will necessarily make you wiser, a better person. But how in human beings in general, it doesn't always do that. And I wanted to be very clear that I was not writing about a quote unquote Jewish era, but a human mistake, you know, at its most, perhaps its most acute or, you know, however, and maybe not even that, but at its most relevant, you know, to Americans. And I thought if you don't take the pain, if you don't take Jewish pain seriously, if you don't take the Holocaust seriously, if you don't take anti-Semitism, you really won't understand what happened here. You know, like it will be too easy to write this off as just some people doing some bad things.
Yeah.
You know?
But you had to try to reconcile that, as you put it, with the existence of Israel.
I did. And I'm saying reconcile, and I know I said reconcile, but I don't like reconcile because it implies that there's a conflict, and I'm not sure there is. And I just don't know enough to know whether this is true or not. But and I hope it's not true, I suspect that more often than not, when people are oppressed, they go on to perpetrate oppression more than they go on to make the world a better place.
Yeah,
I think that probably is a human challenge because I know Israel's not the only place I've heard that story. It is the most acute right now and the hottest right now. And so in that sense, it's not reconciliation. You know, like one does really flow, you know,
right.
to the
It's
other.
It's not as counterintuitive as we'd like it to be. It's not as
we wish it would we wish it were counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But one of the things I'm trying to do in that essay is say, well, what if it's not? What if it's not? And if it's not, then this is beyond the realm of the essay. What do we have to do? Like, what is our work? You know, and I left there thinking about that, man. Like, okay, so this feels like a version of a history that I'm very familiar with, but accelerated way into the future, right? Like times like 10 or something like that, or 100 or whatever. So I am here at this point. I've seen a future. What do I have to say to Black Americans? Like, what do I have to say to us about how we think about our own legacy? And it's hard for us to imagine this, but I don't take it as a given that we will forever be without political power. I don't know that that's true. I don't take it as a given that we will forever be without economic power. And if we weren't, who would we be? You know, who would we be? And I think those are questions that are best asked like right now when we don't have it.
You talked about the experience you saw in the Middle East being familiar. You could see that in our own history as African Americans here. I think some of the examples might be what you saw in the occupied West Bank: checkpoints, segregated roads, cisterns on Palestinian roofs to gather rainwater compared to the country clubs that had swimming pools.
Right.
When you see that, was this one of those things where you immediately had a visceral response and said, that looks like the historical memories that I've had access to?
Oh, I mean the roads right away. You tell me I can't go down a road and that person can. You say this person has one license plate, you got another? The signs, and I know the signs don't literally say Palestinian, Israeli, but they make it clear. The signs make it very clear who's supposed to be on that road.
Yeah.
You know, so it was obvious. And
in Area A, I mean, they literally say,
yeah,
they do. Israel, Israeli.
Right. I think it says illegal, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's illegal for Israelis to go here.
Right.
You know?
And those signs are written by Israel.
Yes, those are signs. Those are not written by the Palestinian Authority. Those are Israeli signs saying that. And so, I mean, that was clear. Like, that was really clear. And then, they started pointing out the differences between, where areas where Palestinians lived and then areas that were settlements. And in your mind, a word like settlement conjures like some, rough pioneers, you know what I mean, living in tents on the outskirts. But really, it's just Levittown. You know what I mean? Like, that's actually, what it is, And understanding that, quote unquote, illegal settlements are actually subsidized by Israel. Like, they're not, like, I had it in my head that somehow this was a problem, you know what I mean, for the Israeli state, but they certainly don't act like it is.
Not so much, yeah.
Not so much, actually. When you're subsidizing it, not so much. And so you start seeing that and you're like, oh. I mean, it's immediately, that was what was so galling about it. Because I felt like people talk about the moral justice or injustice of this in a very, in a way that I now feel like they're trying to obscure. I've said this before, but there really is nothing that someone could do that would make me say segregation, apartheid, Jim Crow are okay. Like, I don't have access to that. I use the death penalty example all the time. There's nothing anybody's going to say to me that person did that I'm going to say they deserve the death penalty. Like, I'm just not going to do that.
Now, the dominant Israeli narrative would be security, that we have to have these roads in order to protect ourselves from Palestinians who not only want self-determination, but their narrative is that Palestinians don't want the Jewish state to exist and they don't want Jews to exist as such.
Yeah, the problem is people think when they say that they therefore sound less like apartheid, less like Jim Crow. But they sound more, actually.
Yeah, right.
They sound more. That just shows like the lack of understanding of the history of those systems and colonialism. Safety is always the point. I am not saying it is necessarily safe. Like, I don't deny that there are Palestinians who want to do harm and Palestinian groups that want. That's not what I'm saying. But again, I go back to, if you told me the death penalty was the only way to guarantee the safety of your community, I would say I still don't believe in the death penalty. I still don't. You know what I mean? It's not situational. You know what I mean? Perhaps people on the other side of the aisle can understand it this way. If you believe abortion is murder, what am I going to say to you? Like, there's nothing, you know what I mean? There's no, you think it's murder.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's like the feeling, I have, you know what I mean? When I'm faced with Jim Crow, when I'm faced with apartheid, there's just nothing you're going to say to me. And unfortunately, the argument of safety is the exact same argument that people who I don't think some of those folks who use that argument actually want to be in league with. It puts you in not great company. Was the security argument or any argument from the pro-Israeli perspective more persuasive to you before you traveled there? The sense that it was complicated was, because I think that plays on a basic notion that we have in our head, which is that stories are complicated, history is complicated. Like that sort of, it rhymes, it feels familiar. Yeah. And the system is complicated. It is. There's a lot of complication there. You know what I mean? Right. But the morality of it, whether this should be happening of it, you know what I mean? If you ask me, the basic should this country be subsidizing the defense of apartheid, of taking people's land, of let's put the buzzwords away, maybe people don't like that. Should it be subsidizing a society that defines democracy by saying half the people deserve one set of rights and everybody else deserves less? No, man, it's just no. It's just no, and there's nothing that anyone's gonna say that's gonna make me say yes to that,
There's a way, both in the book and in your interviews, that you tie the sort of uncomplicated nature of this whole thing, the moral obviousness of it all, to seeing it up close.
Yes.
But you didn't just see it. You read. You read deeply. You read Rashid Khalidi and Noor Arakat and Edward Said and Israeli historians like Benny Morris. And you tied those two things together. A lot of people don't have the opportunity to travel, and certainly to travel to Israel, Palestine. How possible is it to arrive at the conclusion that this thing doesn't make any sense without actually going there?
I think if we had a news media with different commitments, it would be possible. We didn't have to travel to South Africa to understand, but unfortunately we don't have and I've been struggling because there are many journalists who I have admired and who I've looked up to, and media organizations that I admire and I look up to, and I don't think they're clarifying things. I don't think there's that role. And again, I do think that they find it very hard, and I'm sympathetic to this, but to cast people who are in some cases literal like sons and daughters, or grandsons and granddaughters of Holocaust survivors as perpetrators of something that victimizes another group of people. That just like that's a step we have to get. You know what I mean? Like it's like in your mind, it doesn't ordinarily click. The way other things do. And
that's a good faith interpretation of human behavior, though, to some extent.
It is, and I have to start from there. Like I have to start.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but why?
Because my whole way of writing, even though other people don't always receive it this way, is if I were in your shoes, I think this is wrong. But if I were in your shoes, how could I arrive at the same position somewhat honestly?
Yeah.
And I know that I feel that impulse. It's horrifying to think that. Like it's really, probably my earliest moment to true political consciousness that I can think of was I left my parents' house and I went to Howard University and I took Black Diaspora. And this was a class that basically gave a survey of the Black diaspora, literally actually from ancient Egypt all the way up, right? And you got to the slave trade and you had to confront the fact that you were not kidnapped. Like people who you would look at as Black sold you. So it wasn't that these people came and got you. And this was like heartbreaking. This was like devastating. You know what I mean? Like it took like weeks for me to like accept that in my mind because the neat narrative of having been stolen, right, is so much easier. Right. You can easily assign villains, heroes, etc. But no, you soldiers, and then it's like, And so I know that there are like these points in our storytelling that don't always look like 1 + 1, or don't look like we want 1 + 1 to look. And I just think it's hard. I think it's very hard for people.
But you still have a kind of abiding faith in the fundamental, if not goodness, at least sincerity of people.
I feel like the very reason that this has to be obscured speaks to the fundamental, I don't know if I would say goodness. Human beings are not really good at seeing violent immorality for what it is and saying, I'm going to do exactly that. They usually need it obscured in some way.
Yeah.
They need to believe that the victim is somehow not human. They need to believe that it's not happening. They need to believe that it's more like they don't just say, you know what I mean? I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, fully knowing, you know what I mean? They usually come up, like we need stories for this. Yeah. And so I think that speaks to some sort of consciousness, that is there. And I just, hey man, a lot of effort goes into making sure that only a certain view of what's happening over there gets told. And I think if there, were no, if those senses of human goodness weren't there, there'd be no need to lie. people just say what was happening. They just say it.
Right.
You know?
You start the book not in Palestine, but in Senegal.
Mm-hmm.
This is your first time visiting Africa, but which surprised me because I know your father.
Mm-hmm.
I knew how you grew up.
Mm-hmm.
I knew the kind of books you read and the kind of traditions you were exposed to. Why was this? Why now?
Well, I mean, I started traveling relatively late, and I wanted to travel for pleasure. And this was not, I just knew it's not a place, you know what I mean? Like maybe eventually you do go there for pleasure.
The slave castles ain't the first
No,
vacay you
no,
want to take.
no, not at all, not. So much so, and I talk about this in the book, that when I got to where I was staying, it was on the beach, and I walk outside, and there's people on the beach, and I was like offended that they were on a beach acting like it's a beach.
Right.
You know, because it's not a beach, you know what I mean, to me, you know? And so, you know, I have other friends that grew up just like me in close proximity to Nashville who have never been to Africa. You know, because the weight of it is tremendous. You know, it's just tremendous. And I think, you know, it wasn't until I got to a point in my life where I was like, okay, I'm ready to take this on, you know, that I could do it.
With Palestine, there was like the generic, it's complicated, and the kind of media narratives that you have access to. But with Africa, you had a lot more to take on. You had all the narratives, all the stories, all the histories, all the panels and programs you went to your whole life. All of that produces stuff that you have to, you know, kind of wade through. Talk to me about that journey.
Well, I mean, I had made it before I went to Africa, you know, and I guess like what I would refer to is, you know, all of the systems of segregation, enslavement, degradation of African Americans, they begin their stories ultimately in Africa. You know, there's always we pulled you out of the wilds and, you know, you were heathen Christian, couldn't do anything. We educated you. This is better for you, you know, something like that, some version of that. And then there's a whole, you know, flow of entertainment from Tarzan or American traditions that come out of that.
Right.
And we have, you know, as Black people, constructed counter narratives, you know, to those ideas. And part of my political maturity, I guess, or maturation, has been to accept that obviously the dominant narrative is not sufficient, but even the counter narrative isn't. Mostly because the counter narrative is a counter narrative, i.e., it accepts the premises, you know, of the dominant narrative.
Give me an example.
That somehow, whether or not Black people's or the existence of Africans corresponded to what the West would define as civilization determines their worth.
Right.
By which I mean that I need to go and search and find evidence that, you know, Africans built complicated architecture, that they have some sort of, you know, incredible system of mathematics or science, etc. It's fine that they built huge empires and conquered, you know, groups of people. You know what I mean? And then organize them in very complicated, you know, ways. I'm not saying that research shouldn't happen, but that research is wholly irrelevant to your human worth. Right. Like it has nothing to do with that. It has nothing, and the problem is the counter narrative often buys into the premise that somehow we can argue about whether you should have been enslaved, whether you should have been segregated, whether you should have been lynched, by countering notions of your worth.
Yeah.
But I think worth is intrinsic. I don't care if my family was dirt farmers, if I'm a descendant from 20 lines of dirt farmers that did nothing, you know, or what you would call nothing. You know what I mean? It doesn't make me fit for slavery. You know, and this is like a basic thing that I think is really, really important, because not to take it back here, but, you know, one of the great errors, I think, of Zionism was that it bought the narrative. Like it bought a European narrative and then went and constructed Zionism as a kind of counter narrative, but not questioning the very premises of whether land, nation, et cetera, should be tied to you know, notions of blood, ancestry, you know, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I would hate for us to, you know, repeat that mistake.
If you're constantly talking back to the narrative, it also means you're constantly centering whiteness. You're constantly talking back to white people, thinking about white people.
Totally. And you think you're not, but you
Right.
really are. You're like, they are your earth.
Right.
And you're the moon, you know what I mean? Like, you're always rose, wherever their position is, you know, you are counter to that, as opposed to, you know what I mean, trying to figure out what your own stuff should actually be.
Have you figured out a way to write in a way that removes white people from the center of the conversation? Toni Morrison often talked about trying to do that, and in some ways being maybe successful at it in her own estimation. I think she was. But I see a lot of other writers say that how hard that is and how they're not able to do that.
It might be hard because we're American. I'm talking about African American specifically.
Yeah.
Like, it might be hard because we're in this interesting position where we are an ethnic group here, but the state itself puts us automatically in conversation with other people.
Right.
So I don't even know that I had that as a goal. I do have it that I'm very clear on who I'm writing for, which does not mean I don't want other people to read it. You know what I mean? But that I have some clarity about who I'm writing for and what I'm rooted in. You know, I think decentering might be a little bit more important than removing. You know?
Yeah. When I hear you talk about the unique position we're in as African Americans in terms of how we navigate all those issues, it reminded me of something that you wrote. You said, it occurs to me now that I had come to see a part of Africa, but not Africans. What does it mean to be connected to Africa, but to not necessarily think about Africans as such in the way that you're describing
them? The Africans that call to us, the Africans that we think about when we think about our ancestors, the Africans that probably, you know, in our blood, like, tie us to like, they're all dead. They're all dead. And so one of the downsides of my first trip was that I was in the Senegal of the present, but in my mind, I wasn't, you know? And so I think that's okay. I talked to some friends and they were like, that's actually normal for your first trip. That's not crazy, you know?
to just be thinking about the ancestors.
Yeah. And then hopefully what happens is you take 2, 3, 4, and then it's like, okay, now I can see you. And now we can have a conversation. You're present here. Okay, I got it. You know what I mean? This is your country. You know what I mean? We can now have a conversation, you know? But the first time and towards the end of the first time, I did have that actually. That's not true. I had it at the end of the first trip, you know? But for much of it, man, no. I mean, you're in your own head, like, just thinking about Jesus Christ. And then you look at the people and the people look so familiar to you, you know what I mean? And it's that, and it's a serious experience. You know what is interesting? Before I went to I'd been to the Caribbean. It'd been fine. You know, even though horrific violence happened, obviously, in Jamaica, you know what I mean? Right. But it was fine. There was no, I could see Jamaicans, I could talk to Jamaicans. I was very interested, you know, like I was anywhere else. Like, I didn't want to be sequestered in a resort. I really wanted to, you know, that was not my relationship with Senegal at all. No, because that's the origin point. And that was how I felt. Right. You know what I mean? This is, you know, Jamaica, I thought I was going to see cousins. You know what I mean? Like, that's how that felt. And Africa, it was like, oh man, this is like a pilgrimage to some, you know, ancient ancestors, you know, graveyard or something, you know?
Wow. The other essay in the book is not abroad. It's right here in the United States. You go to Columbia, South Carolina, and you visited a high school teacher who was not allowed to teach Between the World and Me, your 2015 book. And the reason, which never ceases to amaze me, is that white students complained that it made them feel ashamed for being white. Help me make sense of how we get from the racial reckoning of 2020, where America was finally coming to terms with its racial past and its to a moment not that long after, where white people were like,
within months.
Well, white people were like,
years.
I can't do this history thing, man. It's making me a little uncomfortable.
Well, I think in defense of white people, there are a lot of them and they're different groups. And I actually saw that. I mean, you know, I talk about, you know, actually the need to go places, and I saw that. I mean, I think that reckoning had more effect than maybe we think. It just didn't have enough.
Okay. What effect did it have?
It had the effect that I was in deep red Columbia, South Carolina at a school board meeting, and a woman who might have been in her early 70s wanted to talk to me about Colson Whitehead. You know, and how her all-white church had started a book group. And this was 2023, so this is a while later. This is not 2020, you know, and how they had started, it was so funny. She said, we started a book group, only did Black authors. I said, wow, that's incredible. She said, yeah, we tried to reach out, to a Black church and have some partnership. They came to a couple meetings and stopped going. And I was like,
sounds about right.
You know what I mean? Well, because they don't want to have to work and you know what? I applaud them because they kept going. Like they didn't say, oh, these Black folks don't want to deal with this, so, therefore we can drop this.
Right.
They had kept going. You know what I mean? And, I think that what I saw down there actually was a critical mass, not a majority, but a significant minority of white people who understood that reading Black authors, reading LGBTQ authors, reading authors who may not sound like the traditional was now part of what it meant to be an educated person.
Right.
Whatever they think of those politics.
Yeah.
And they don't want their kids going out into the world and not being able to talk. Like they have dreams and ambitions, for their kids. And they want their kids to be able to go out and, explore the world. Now, there are people that don't want their kids to explore the world. There are people that want their kids to reify the world as it is or as they see it. And for those people, books are very, very dangerous because a book is a one-on-one interface. If it's your kid in that book. You know what I mean? It's not like kids watching something on TV and you can see it right there, right? The kid is bringing their imagination and what they're seeing to the book. And that mind meld that forms is very dangerous for a certain type of parent because that parent can't get in there. That kid has his own interior private life. And so if you are of the mind that you're trying to not just erect hierarchy, but continue it, a hierarchy of a certain type, you don't want those kind of mind melds happening because you don't know where that kid's going.
Right. And that's how you get the bans and the censorship.
And exactly. I actually think it's really intelligent. I mean, kind of brute, but I get it. I get it. I wasn't like, wow, why are you doing? People say, oh, it's just a book. It's like, no. Either it's powerful or it's not. And I come from a tradition that says it's powerful. So if it is, then I completely understand what they're doing. I disagree with it. I think it's wrong, and dumb, but.
In 2014, you wrote a piece for The Atlantic that is one of the most celebrated pieces of your career. It's called The Case for Reparations. In it, you discuss the subject of reparations for slavery and racial inequality. You cite Germany's payments to Israel after the Holocaust as an example of reparations. In the message you write, within days of publishing The Case for Reparations, I began to feel the mistake, but it took years for the depth of that mistake and thus my own debt to compound. I was struck, one, at the humility of it, right? Most writers don't like to say, I messed up. Most intellects don't like to say I messed up. They just move on to the next thing. Talk to me about your journey, not just of realizing that you made a mistake, but also of sharing that with the public.
I think it's a mistake that writers don't admit they make mistakes. It's, everybody knows human beings make mistakes. How you know what I mean? Like, come on. So I've never bought into that. But because I very, very much define myself as a writer, I guess the first thing that happened was the critique came a week, maybe tops. And it wasn't like a yelling critique. It was a real critique. You know what I mean? It was like, I take this seriously. And I was like, yeah. And I didn't understand the yeah. I just vaguely understood that I had not been curious about what this state that had taken German reparations had actually done. And I knew that was deeply in conflict with the moral argument that I was making, which was not merely a payoff argument, but that we are trying to make the world safe from certain things, right? Certain systems. And if you take the money, but you know what I mean, you perpetrate another, crime of inhumanity. It's not clear to me, what happened there. And so that was an immediate inconsistency. I knew I had to correct it in writing. I knew that. I just knew that had to happen. I knew I could not, because it got so much attention.
Yeah.
And unless I did something that got the same level of attention, and it wasn't until I got over there that I really got it. And it was hard. It was really, really hard. It was emotionally hard. It was emotionally very difficult. And I think one of the things that's come out of this, and I'm sure you've had this experience. I know you've had this experience. it's hard to think of yourself as a Black person with a level of privilege. And then you meet people from a community that have been completely pushed out of the frame, shunted, right?
Yeah.
And they say to you, thank you. And it's sometimes like hard for me to hear that. I mean, in part because of the case for reparations, but also just like, this is messed up. Like, it's messed up that I get to go on CBS and say X, Y, and Z. Like, that's not right. You know, because I have this feeling that I can point out the basic inconsistencies that are very, very clear. But there are people who have lived this, man, like who really, really know it, you know, in their bones. And, you know, the thanks just remind me, you know, of the absence of those voices. So, yeah.
There's been a media backlash to the Israel-Palestine section of the book in general, but the most acute one to me was on CBS Mornings when anchor Tony DeCopel said that your writing, quote, would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. You know, his point, as I understood it, and it wasn't a great point, but was that you left out historical context, you left out the Israeli perspective, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see that interview as a kind of signpost of a broader kind of way that you've been treated by the media with regard to this book, or was that somewhat exceptional?
I think that was exceptional. Yeah, I haven't really, you know, I've certainly had debates and arguments with people since then, you know, in the media, which you should.
Yeah.
Which you should. It became clear that as far as I was concerned, he didn't just have pointed questions, but you know that you know his beliefs were, you know, really, really clear. You know, and so I was right there with that guy. You know what I mean? Like the person who truly believes that, you know, not just that Israel has a right to exist, which is, you know, somewhat of a dodge as far as I'm concerned, but that it's just, that the project's just, the project is correct. And that was like, you know what I mean? Like, I really felt like that had to be confronted, you know what I mean? And that was the, you know, why I, you know, made the point about apartheid, et cetera. Like you're right. His thing was there's some sort of context that maybe could have been included. But again, there is no context for me for Jim Crow. There's no context that makes that. There are things that are done in this world. And maybe context explains them. Maybe context explains like how they got, but there's no context that will make you feel morally different about it.
Let me ask you about that, because I hear you say that, and I also heard you make a comparison of the October 7th Hamas attacks to Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Right here on the show, Norm Finkelstein made a very similar analysis. And the question always is, how do you render a moral judgment on Nat Turner in that moment? There are some who would say, you know, killing 55 white men, women, and children is morally indefensible, and there's no context that could explain it. Then there are others who say,
Yeah, I mean, there's context. Again, there's context to explain it. I think I give enough context to explain, for instance, Israeli apartheid. I can explain it, but...
And what I'm trying to push you on, though, is to think about the Hamas part of it.
Yes.
Because there are people who have been challenged to say what Hamas did was indefensible, unexplainable. Or Nat Turner, I understand why he did
Wait, those are two different things, though.
No. What I'm saying is
inexplicable, because I think it is explicable. I also think it was horrific. And it's taken me a long time to get here. The harder one, like, I would say the same about Nat Turner, ultimately.
Woo!
Yeah.
All them old heads on the panels back in the day are turning over in their graves. I'm not saying they're wrong, I'm just saying that I could imagine how much of a reckoning it is to get there.
But Mark, I have to be honest with you. Once I read the story as the story was, it always bothered me.
Why?
You killed a baby in his crib. This is without any political sophistication. No, you know what I mean? I read I know, you know, philosophical anything. What? Like, that just bothered me. And, you know, I wonder how much of our morality is hardwired or what? And I don't mean morality like one is better than the other, but just what our sense of right and wrong. That always bothered me, man. And I understand it. Like, I get how you can be completely deprived of all rights, including your body, you know, the ability to protect your family, and how low that can make you feel. But I can't get to it.
Mm.
I can't get to it. And I, you know, and what I've done, and even in that October 7th case, is I have tried to even put myself, you know, in there. And I understand, like, and I've said this before, like, how you feel, how you could feel when these people have completely circumvented and defined your life. You know what I mean? Like, literally kept you enclosed. You know, your parents or grandparents or aunts, uncles trying to fish, shot, you know, shot at. I was with somebody this weekend, man, activists. She had pictures of this. Like, she had pictures of the fishermen who had been wounded. You know what I mean? Just because of the blockade, going out trying to do their job. It's not that I don't understand where the violence comes from. It's not that I understand, like, because I think this is common across, you know, movements, right? Like, I don't think you can find a freedom movement where somebody did something and you weren't kind of like,
for sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And for me, I think I have limits at butchering people. I don't know how practical that is. I don't know what that means in terms of what, you know what I mean? Like, there are probably a lot of people who are in movements say, what are you talking about, Ta-Nehisi? But as a writer and as somebody who situates themselves in the world of, you know, moral imagination, that's just not, I am not that kind. I should not be the person leading that revolutionary movement. I probably shouldn't be anywhere near it. You know what I mean? Because I'm, you know, as impractical as it is, I'm probably going to be the ones that say, maybe you shouldn't do that. At least that's my best version of myself. You know? So yeah.
So you've written a book, you've put it out in the world, it's being received, it's being consumed. The history will say, you know, how, you know, it's ultimately understood. But what do you do next? You know, historically, you've gone back to the desk. You've gone back to work and moved on to the next project. But all those projects have been in the service of Black liberation in a certain kind of way. This book is, I won't call it an outlier, but there's a way that you've also entered this other conversation on Palestine. When you go back to the desk, do you leave that over there, or are you still going to be involved?
But I never leave any of it over there, though. You know, I think, like, even Reparations is here. Like, it's here in this book. Case Reparations is in this book. And in many ways, Between the World and Me is in, you know, this could be described as a continuation, you know, of much of what's in Between the World and Me. So I never leave it. I do, I find that I have a politic or a set of politics that is probably similar to many of my political allies in the movement. But I probably do my best work at some distance. You know, not throwing rocks, not yelling at people, you know what I mean? Like, I don't do that either, but just that I need to think through Nat Turner by myself. You know what I mean? Or in a room with like 3 other people. I need to think through October 7th, like in a room with 3 other people, you know what I mean? By myself. I just, because that is how I, you know, it's tough to write in a crowd. It's tough to write in a crowd. And so I probably will go back to the desk. I do think, I don't know what I will do if I don't know what I will do if this escalates. Because we are in a particular moment.
Yes.
And it may be that, you know, you don't have the luxury of doing certain things. You know, when I got back last year, I was like, I'm not gonna say anything about the strip. The book is gonna come out next year, and that's when I'll talk about it. I won't say anything about it. And then October 7th happened, and then the genocide began. And it was like, damn it.
Right.
Like, I really don't have the privilege of not saying anything. You know, I just saw this, and I have to tell people what I saw. You know, but I didn't want to. I wanted to, you know, just, you know, keep going and keep grinding. So we'll see. We'll see.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thanks, brother. Thank you so much. All right.